Montana Territory, June 1883. The wind came down off the mountains hard that morning, and Rosalind Dearing did not have the strength to brace against it. She pressed her shawl tighter around her baby and kept walking, boots dragging through the grit of the dry trail road just south of Deer Lodge. Her son stirred in the sling pressed to her chest, and she whispered soft things to calm him, though her own voice shook. She had not seen a man in weeks, had not let one near her baby since the day he was born. And now, with her last coin traded for oats and a half jar of honey, she knew she could not make it another night in the open. The baby whimpered. Rosalind slowed to check under the cloth, brushing her fingertips down his soft cheek. "You are safe," she said. "You are safe with me." She had been saying it since the morning she fled the mining camp, blood still drying under her fingernails, fear clawing up her throat. She had not looked back since. Just over the ridge, smoke curled from a distant chimney. The shape of a barn stood firm against the sky, and beside it, a cabin. Rosalind's boots slipped a little in the dust as she turned toward it. Her legs ached from the miles, but her baby needed shelter. Whatever man lived there, if it was a man, she would not let him touch her son. She reached the fence post by late afternoon, her breath coming short. The place was quiet. A windmill creaked. Chickens scattered in the yard. Then a tall figure stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He paused when he saw her. He was younger than she expected. Mid-20s maybe. Broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with a face that looked like it had seen its share of hard years but met them head-on. He took a step forward, slow. "You lost?" he asked, voice steady but not unkind. Rosalind gripped the fence tighter. "No," he tipped his hat back, squinting at the sling across her chest. "You need help." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked over the man's dusty shirt, worn gloves shoved in his back pocket, revolver holstered but untouched. "Just need a place to rest," she said. "A night." "Maybe two," he nodded once. "You can have the bunkhouse, no one else using it." "Alone?" she asked. "Of course." He nodded toward the baby. "Looks like you need quiet more than anything." She hesitated. "I do not want him held." "Not by a man." The cowboy looked at her a long moment, then gave a solid nod. "Understood." That night, after she fed the baby and laid him on the cot beside her, she sat by the window and watched the lights from the main house. She didn't even know the man's name, but something about how he'd spoken firm, calm, without a trace of pity stuck in her chest. The next morning she woke to a knock. She opened the door to find a tin plate of biscuits, a jar of milk, and a folded note. "If you need more, just ask." Dawson Hale. She read the name twice. Then, without meaning to, she smiled. The days passed quietly. Dawson kept his word, giving her space, but always leaving something by the door: wood for the stove, eggs, once a small tin toy horse carved by hand, which she found odd until she realized how her son's eyes followed it. Rosalind stayed mostly inside, but twice she let herself step out and watch Dawson break horses in the corral. He moved with a calm she hadn't seen in a long time. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. The horses trusted him, and she found herself watching longer than she meant to. On the fourth day, the baby cried harder than usual. She tried everything: feeding, rocking, walking the floor, but he would not settle. Her hands trembled from exhaustion. Her eyes stung. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it with the baby still in her arms. Dawson stood there, holding a small linen sack. "Chamomile, my mother swore by it." Rosalind blinked. "Thank you." He glanced at the baby, who was wailing now. "May I?" He paused. "I know what you said, but if you ever want a break, I have held babies before." "My sister had 3. Her arms were shaking. Her back ached from days of holding him close. She looked down at her son, then back up at Dawson. She stepped back. Just sit." Dawson came in slow, taking off his hat. He sat on the edge of the bench. Rosalind looked at her son, then at Dawson's outstretched arms. She hesitated, then laid the baby in them. The crying stopped. Dawson adjusted slightly, cradling the boy against his chest. "He fits right here in my arms," he said quietly, voice full of something she had not heard in years: gentleness without expectation. Rosalind pressed a hand to her mouth. "No man has ever held him." Dawson looked up. "I will not hurt him, or you." She nodded, eyes glassy. From that moment, something shifted. She still stayed in the bunkhouse, but she came to the main house more often. They ate together some evenings, talked. He asked about where she came from, careful not to press too hard. She told him her baby's name Rustin and how she had no one left. Dawson never asked about the father. Instead, he showed her how to tend the garden behind the barn, how to fix the loose hinge on the bunkhouse door, how to brace a fence against a storm. One evening, she laughed at something he said, and it startled them both. "I forgot how that sounded," she said softly. "I could listen to it every day," he said, equally soft. She looked at him for a long time. "You really mean that?" "I do." She glanced down at Rustin, asleep in his arms once again. Maybe we stay a little longer." Dawson brushed his thumb gently across Rustin's blanket. "As long as you want." By the time July light deepened to gold, Rosalind had begun feeding the hens in the early morning before Dawson left for the far pasture. He never asked her to, but she noticed he lingered at the gate when she came out, waiting until she reached the coop before heading out with his saddle slung over one shoulder. When she caught him watching, he didn't look away. Not once. The bunkhouse stayed hers, but she found herself drifting toward the main house more often, usually around dusk, when the air softened and the baby dozed on her hip. Dawson would be on the porch, whittling or oiling a bit of tack, and he always cleared a seat beside him without a word. One evening, after a dry wind stirred dust across the yard, Dawson nodded toward the cottonwoods behind the house. "You ever been down by the creek?" She shook her head. "Didn't know there was one. Runs just past that rise. Cold enough to keep a body honest, even in July." He leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "I could show you, if you want." Her shoes were worn thin, but she said yes. He didn't reach for her hand as they walked, just kept pace beside her while Rustin slept in the sling. The cottonwoods rustled overhead, thick with cicadas, and the creek came into view, narrow and swift with stones smoothed flat by time. Rosalind sat on a fallen log and pulled off her boots, then dipped her feet into the current. It bit at first, then settled into something bearable. Dawson crouched nearby, hands on his knees, watching the water. "You said your sister had children," she said. He nodded. "Twins first, then another boy a few years later. She's in Bozeman now. Married a baker. Do you miss her?" "Every day." She studied his face, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of family. "Why'd you stay here alone?" He picked up a flat stone, turned it in his hand. "My father built this place. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to let it go." He tossed the stone across the water. It skipped once, then sank. "Some things are worth holding on to." She watched the ripples fade, even when it's hard, especially then. Rustin stirred against her chest. She hushed him gently, brushing her thumb across his brow. Dawson didn't speak, just watched with a stillness that settled into her bones. "I used to be a teacher," she said, surprising herself. He looked at her, eyes steady. "What you teach?" "Reading, writing, some arithmetic, mostly to girls." "In Kansas before." She trailed off. He didn't press. "I miss books," she said after a while. "The smell of them, ink on paper. I used to copy poems into a ledger when it got quiet." He stood and walked a few steps back toward the trees. When he returned, he held out a wrapped parcel. "Been meaning to give you this. Found it in my mother's things." She took it carefully. Inside was a worn copy of Longfellow's collected poems, the pages yellowed and soft at the corners. Rosalind looked up, throat tight. "Why would you keep this all these years?" "She loved it," he said simply. "Thought you might too." That night, back in the bunkhouse, she read aloud from the book while Rustin nursed. Her voice caught on a line about stillness and stars, and she pressed the spine closed, holding it to her chest. The next morning, Dawson asked her to ride out with him to check the north fence line. He'd already saddled his mare and a smaller gelding, calm and slow-gaited. "I haven't ridden since before he was born," she said. "You don't have to go far, just thought it might feel good. The wind out there's different." He built a sling from a shawl and leather strap, tying Rustin to her front with practiced care. The baby slept the whole ride, rocked by the rhythm of the horse. They didn't talk much, but the quiet between them wasn't empty. It held something steady, like a root running deep beneath the soil. When they stopped under a bluff to rest the horses, Dawson handed her a strip of jerky and a tin cup of cool water. "You trust me more than you used to," he said. She met his gaze. "I do," he nodded, slow. "I want to ask you something, not now, not yet, but soon." Rosalind's heart thudded once in her chest, not from fear but from something warmer. Then I'll wait to hear it, she said. They rode home in silence, the sun slanting low behind them. That evening, she laid Rustin down in the bunkhouse and stepped outside, barefoot in the grass. Dawson was leaning against the porch rail, arms folded. She crossed the yard without hesitation. When she reached him, she didn't speak. He held her gaze for a long moment, then reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Rosalind closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, the touch felt safe. Not taken, not forced. Given she opened her eyes, he didn't kiss her, but he didn't have to, not yet. The first rain in weeks came at dusk, soft as breath and steady as hoofbeats. Rosalind stood at the open doorway of the bunkhouse, cradling Rustin against her chest as the scent of wet earth rose around them. Dawson was in the garden, sleeves rolled, soil dark up to his elbows. He didn't turn when the rain came, just lifted his face to it like someone remembering something lost. Rosalind stepped down barefoot, the packed dirt cool beneath her feet. She crossed the yard slowly, stopping just outside the garden fence. "You'll drown those beans," she said, voice low over the sound of water tapping leaves. Dawson looked up, rain in his lashes. "They'll welcome it." He leaned back on his heels, resting his hands on his thighs. The rain clung to his hair, turned his shirt near black. She hadn't seen him like this before, still, stripped down to the bone of himself by the storm. "Come inside," she said. He stood without a word and followed her in. She lit the lamp low and laid Rustin in the cradle Dawson had built from cedar and old wagon boards. The baby didn't stir. The rain softened on the roof, a hush that seemed to pull the walls closer. Dawson stood near the stove, his shirt dripping. He didn't shiver. Rosalind moved to the trunk and pulled out one of the blankets she used for Rustin, then crossed to him and draped it around his shoulders. She held it there a moment longer than needed. "You ever been married?" she asked. He looked at her, rain still in his brow. "No, why not? Didn't find the right woman." She nodded slowly. "What would she be like if you had?" He glanced toward the cradle. "She'd be someone who knows what matters, who doesn't flinch from hard things, who carries more than folks see but still steps forward." Rosalind didn't look away. "That's not a small wish. I've waited a long time." She moved past him to the stove, poured hot water from the kettle into a tin basin. She dipped a cloth, wrung it out, and handed it to him. "You'll catch cold standing like that." He took it, but his eyes stayed on her. "You planning to leave?" "I don't know. You said maybe you'd stay." "I did." He folded the cloth once in his hands, then set it down on the table. "I'd like it if you did." She crossed her arms, sleeves damp where the rain had touched her. "It's not an easy thing, putting down roots again. I wouldn't ask you to forget what came before, just to let something new grow beside it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It held the weight of every night she'd stood watch while her son cried, every time she'd walked a road with no end in sight. And now here was this man, not asking her to hand it over, just to share the burden. "You said you wanted to ask me something," she said. He stepped closer, slow and sure. "I want to build a life with you, with him, if you want that too." Rosalind looked down at Rustin, who lay still in his sleep, one fist tucked against his chin. She thought of the way Dawson had held him, gentle as if holding the edge of dawn. "You take him as your own?" she asked. "I already have." She reached out then, took his hand where it hung at his side. His skin was rough, but the way he held hers was careful, like he knew how easily things could break. She nodded just once. Dawson's breath caught, and he stepped forward, pressing his forehead to hers. No kiss. Just the weight of a promise between them, warm and solid. Outside, the rain slowed. Inside, the lamp burned steady. The garden rows were thick with late summer green, and Rosalind knelt between them, hands deep in the dirt, coaxing weeds from around the bases of the squash vines. Rustin slept nearby in a woven basket Dawson had lined with a wool shirt, shaded beneath the cotton cloth she'd stitched to stretch across two posts. His breaths were slow, and even the kind that came only when the world beneath him felt steady. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and sat back on her heels, watching a blue dragonfly drift over the beans. The soil under her nails, warm and damp, had become familiar. Her back ached from the bending, but it was the ache of work, not fear. Dawson's whistle cut through the stillness. She looked up to see him leading a wagon toward the barn, a new canvas cover stretched tight over its ribs. A man she didn't recognize sat beside him, older, with a long beard and a tan vest dusted from the road. She rose slowly, brushing her skirt clean, and met them as they halted the team. "This is Mr. Candler," Dawson said, climbing down. "Used to be a carpenter up around Helena. He's here to help us build." "Build what?" she asked, though something in her chest already stirred with the shape of the answer. Dawson reached into the wagon bed for the rolled papers tucked between two crates. He unrolled them on the hood of the nearest barrel. "A sketch, lines and measurements, the start of something with 2 rooms and a porch facing west. Not grand, but solid. We'll raise it before the frost sets in," he said. "Enough space for the 3 of us." "And a root cellar." Rosalind laid her hand on the page, her fingers tracing the lines that marked a hearth. "You started this already," he nodded. "Soon as you said you'd stay." Mr. Candler tipped his hat. "I can start cutting the frame tomorrow." "You got a fine spot picked just north of the old apple tree. Good drainage, close to the well." She turned toward Dawson. "You've been planning this while I was pulling weeds." He shrugged, but his face had gone soft at the edges. "Didn't want to speak on it before I knew you were ready." She looked back at the sketch. "I want to help lay every board." "You will," he said. "This'll be yours as much as mine." That evening, with Rustin curled in her lap, she sat on the porch beside Dawson as the last light pulled long across the fields. Mr. Candler had taken the bunkhouse. The house they'd live in wasn't real yet, not in boards or beams, but she could feel it like breath, something forming just beneath the skin of the land. "Did your mother keep a garden?" she asked quietly. "She did," he said. "She liked to plant things in rows so straight you'd think she used a string to guide her hand, but she never did. Mine grew herbs in pots along the window. Said if a house didn't smell like rosemary and stew bone, it wasn't a home." Dawson chuckled low. "Sounds like she had her priorities straight. She wouldn't have liked that I ran. She'd have known why." Rosalind looked down at Rustin, who stirred but didn't wake. "He's the only part of that life I'd keep. He's worth all of it." She turned to him, the shadows stretching across his face now, but not hiding the quiet certainty in his eyes. "When you first saw me, what did you think? I thought you looked like someone who was still standing when others would have fallen, and I thought if I gave you space, maybe you'd stay." She reached over, took his hand, calloused and warm. "I think I was always coming here. I just didn't know it yet." Wind moved through the trees behind them, carrying the scent of pine and earth and rain-soaked wood. He didn't let go of her hand. Inside, the cradle waited. And soon, a house would rise, a place with walls they built together, where nothing would come through without their say. They didn't speak again that evening, not because there was nothing left to say, but because there was nothing that needed saying. The silence held every promise that mattered. The first frost came early that year, ringing the last of the squash vines with silver and thinning the breath of the horses before sunrise. Dawson had already laid the foundation weeks earlier, and the new house stood framed and roofed now, the scent of fresh cut pine still strong on the boards. Inside, the walls waited for chinking, and a stove sat in a crate near the door, hauled up from Deer Lodge by wagon the week before. Rosalind stood beside the hearth, running her hand along the smooth edge of the mantel. Dawson had carved it himself, with a steady hand and a quiet pride he never said aloud. She could see the faint curl of the grain, where the knife had followed the knot and left it whole. "Window glass will be here before the week's out," Dawson said behind her. "If weather holds, we'll finish before the snow comes." She turned, wiping a fleck of dust from her skirt. "I never imagined having a home with real windows. You'll have them on every wall. You'll wake to the sun, not smoke." Rustin was in the crook of her arm, eyes wide and curious. He had begun to babble when Dawson spoke, as if recognizing the weight of his voice. Dawson reached out and touched the boy's knuckles, careful as always. "Tomorrow," Dawson said, "I'll ask the Reverend to ride out." Rosalind looked down at her son, then back to Dawson. "You want a church wedding? I want to marry you proper, with your name said under open sky. Doesn't have to be in town, just real." She nodded slowly. "I want that too." They wed 2 days later beneath the cottonwoods that bordered the creek, the same trees where she'd first let her guard fall. Mr. Candler stood witness, his fingers curled around his hat brim, and the Reverend from Deer Lodge read from a small leather-bound book with water-stained corners. Rosalind wore a dress sewn from muslin Dawson had traded for nothing fancy, but clean and light as wind. Dawson wore his best shirt, sleeves rolled neat, his suspenders brushed free of dust. Rustin was held in the Reverend's wife's arms, content and blinking into the trees. When Dawson took Rosalind's hand, he didn't speak vows that hadn't been lived. He just said her name, slow and certain, and she answered with his. They shared coffee and bread afterward on the porch of the new house, the wind carrying the scent of coming snow. Dawson sat beside her with his arm behind her back, not touching unless she leaned, and she did tired, but warm to the bone. That evening, with Rustin sleeping in his cedar cradle near the hearth, they lit the stove for the first time. Dawson struck the match, and she added the kindling. The fire caught quick, the way it always did when both hands knew the work. She poured water into a tin cup and handed it to Dawson. We didn't say vows about what we'd do when things get hard. He looked at her over the rim. Don't need to. We've already done it. She knelt beside Rustin's cradle, brushing a hand over his curls. He won't remember any of this beginning. Dawson crouched beside her, but he'll grow up in it, that matters more. She leaned into him then, her temple resting against his shoulder. I never thought I'd feel safe again. He turned just enough to press his lips to her hair. You are now, always. Outside the wind picked up, but inside the house held steady. Months passed, snow came and stayed. Dawson carved a rocking chair in the long dark evenings, and Rosalind stitched curtains from cloth sent by Dawson's sister in Bozeman. Rustin took his first steps across the pine floor, from her hands to Dawson's, his laughter echoing in the eaves. By spring, the garden had been planted again, rows neat and wide enough to walk between. Rosalind taught Dawson letters in the evenings, and he practiced tracing her name on scraps of paper, slow and deliberate. When the weather warmed, Dawson built a bench beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. Some evenings they sat there with Rustin between them, his hands full of pebbles and moss, the light slanting low across the water. Rosalind turned her face to the sun and felt it on her cheeks, warm and steady. You know, she said one afternoon, watching Rustin toddle across the grass, I think I could teach again. Not in a schoolhouse maybe, but here. There are families near enough. Dawson nodded. We'll build a table long enough for any child who needs a lesson. She looked at him, the man who'd never once asked her to be anything but what she was. You've given me more than I ever asked for. You gave me you, he said. That's everything. She reached for his hand, her fingers slipping into his without needing to search, and when Rustin looked back at them, grinning with all his tiny teeth, they knew they'd built something no fire, no storm, no memory could take from them. The land would change. Seasons would pass, but they would not leave this place or each other, because what they'd made was not just shelter, it was home.